and welcome to another campfire session presented by Encamp. I am your host, Brandon Barlow, along with Encamp CEO Luke Jacobs. Today, we will be discussing water supply sustainability and how it is affecting the food and beverage industry. This is a major environmental topic that is not only affecting companies now, but is also affecting the way they will conduct business into the future. Our guests today are Dr. Michael Washburn. He is a senior consultant in food and beverage segment leader at Antea Group. We also have Julia Mouton, who is a environmental engineer as well as a sustainability professional at Antea Group as well. So welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us. And how you doing today?
Thank you, Brandon. We're good. Nice
Thank
to see
you. Yeah, doing
Perfect.
great. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're excited to have you. We're kind of running a nice food and beverage, campaign, and we're really trying to, hone in on trying to help that industry. But we really wanted to dive into some of the major issues that they are dealing with. So before we do that, can you guys give us a brief introduction of yourselves and just a little bit of information on Antea Group?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump and do that. So I'm Michael Washburn. As was mentioned, I'm a senior consultant and I run the food and beverage consulting group at Antea. For folks who don't know Antea Group, we're one of the largest environmental services firms in the world. We do environmental engineering and environmental health and safety and sustainability consulting. Julie and I are with Antea Group US, which is one of several offices around the world. My expertise and background is I'm actually trained in forestry and land conservation, but I have worked in sustainability now for a couple of decades, including leading the sustainability enterprise at Nestle Waters North America for a while. And I've been with Antea Group for about a year and a half. So this topic of water stewardship has been an important part of my whole career, and I'm eager to have the chat with you.
Absolutely. Julie, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say that I'm currently based out of Austin, Texas, but formerly of Seattle. And I have 15 years of experience in environmental health, safety, and sustainability consulting. 13 and a half years have been with Antea Group, and I'm what we like to call a boomerang. So I started with the firm back in 2005 out of grad school, and then I went to another consulting firm briefly, and then came back because I just really enjoy working at Antea Group, and it's the family culture that we have here. But I do like to focus on helping companies, especially global companies, reduce their operational EHS&S risks. I love working on projects around sustainability strategy and goal setting, as well as water stewardship projects. And I serve on Antea Group's food and beverage segment leadership team with the direction of Michael. And I am also supporting our global operational support service line and leading Antea Group's water stewardship service line.
So wearing many hats, to say the least, if I can say that, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely fun and challenging.
So this is a question maybe for you, Michael. So specifically with your group in the food and bev sector, what separates your group from other consultants?
Well, so first, just in terms of defining the segment, the food and beverage segment for us, the company has several different sectors that we service. We provide services to the chemical segment, to oil and gas, railroads, manufacturers, and technology, as well as retail and insurance and investment companies. So it's a broad reach, and my focus is the food and beverage segment, as was mentioned. This includes the world's largest food and beverage manufacturers, whether it's processed foods or alcoholic beverages, bottled water. It's quite a span. We have a little over 50 clients active with us right now, and that group is serviced by about 20 or so consultants, along with teams of subject matter experts. And as you said, Julie wears almost all of those hats. She's a subject matter expert as well as a consultant, and a very important part of our team.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. So when we had a conversation earlier, we were kind of brainstorming, hey, what kind of topic do we want to talk about? We really kind of honed in on climate change, as well as water supply sustainability or water scarcity as being something we really wanted to talk about. So clean water is very important, and enough water is important in a lot of industries. But can you guys, Julie, maybe can you kind of dive in and just let me know how important it is to the food and beverage industry?
Absolutely. Well, food and beverage, it's just, water is an essential ingredient, especially to the beverage industry. It's the main ingredient. But going back to your question, you're right. Clean water is very critical. However, many of the watersheds that we have studied over the last 11 years do not have that pristine water quality. In fact, I was recently analyzing some data from studies that we've conducted since 2018, and the risk of contamination is actually popping up as the highest ranked vulnerability in these studies. And so to achieve water potability standards for food application, treatment is necessary. And that can be costly for food and beverage companies. But the fact that a sustainable water supply, it's not just about having clean water, like you said, it's about having enough water, or maybe sometimes there's too much water. So there's challenges in between having too much water, having not enough water. For example, I was recently looking at a watershed in the United States, the Rio Grande actually, reviewing a technical report for that watershed. And it's actually estimated that up to 40% of this particular city water supply is lost as the water is transported in unlined irrigation channels to the city's reservoirs. And so these treatments, the transmission, the distribution, all of those are equally important water-related business risks that should also be considered in addition to water quality and water supply, the available water supply.
You mentioned having too much water. Can you kind of dive in just a little bit on that?
Absolutely. So with climate change and extreme weather events, sometimes, monsoon seasons, tsunamis, floods, sea level rise, all of these impacts can lead to having too much water in an area that will affect the water supplies and it'll affect the water quality. Oftentimes, when you have an area that, maybe they're having an extreme weather event where the rainfall intensity is so high that the water's not having enough time to infiltrate into the ground and recharge those aquifers, that water supply is going to run off and go right into a surface water body, which will pick up as it's running across the land. It'll pick up, solids or maybe garbage, other types of pollutants, maybe oil if it's going along the streets. And that is going to go right into the surface water bodies, the storm water. So we consider that as non-point source pollution. And so all of that non-point source pollution is contributing to surface water quality issues. Like here in Texas, we have a lot of non-point source pollution issues because of that runoff from having too much water all at once.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's one of the things when I was, kind of preparing for this, I was always looking at the scarcity issue, but then you bring up having too much water as easily, and that could be a huge problem as well.
Absolutely.
So to me, this is a major issue, kind of leading to this sector. But like, how big of an issue is it? So if we're looking at the big, grand scheme of things in food and bev industry, how high are we talking? This problem.
Well, I'll speak to that, Brandon. So, if you're thinking about sort of ranking the risks, it's hard to separate climate change from water in the context of risk. So, as Julie said, rising sea levels, extreme storm events, those are largely climate change driven events, but the manifestation in terms of operational risk is this issue of too much water or water in the wrong place.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, though, to your point about scarcity, we're seeing prolonged droughts. I live in Arizona, and water professionals in this part of the world are moving toward no longer calling our circumstance a drought because it has been so prolonged and is predicted to be continuing. And drought is usually thought of as a temporary circumstance. So this issue of scarcity is real, and it's not just here in the American West. It's been true in many places around the world, including parts of Europe and India and Africa and elsewhere. As Julie said, water is the key ingredient. And if I may, I want to just share with the audience some interesting perspective, because I think most people intuitively understand that when you're talking about beverages, there's a lot of water involved. I used to work in the bottled water industry, and I was interested to learn that bottled water as a category globally uses approximately 1/100th of a percent of the global freshwater supply. So, bottled water is arguably the most visible use of water in an industry, but it's the invisible water that we often don't think about. So, for example, 70% of the fresh water in the world, some estimates run as high as 80%, goes to commercial agriculture. And about a quarter of that water goes to produce meat.
Mm-hmm.
So, you've heard the issue of food waste. Well, when we're throwing away food, we're throwing away not just the food, we're throwing away all the water that went into its creation, whether that was the irrigation or the production, and we're throwing away all the energy. So, food waste is a big associated issue here. Just a couple quick statistics. It takes about 1,800 gallons of water to produce a pound of beef.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking at a typical lunch, think of a turkey and cheese sandwich with a bag of chips and a soda. That's about 200 gallons of water you're looking at. So you can't feed the world population without a sustained supply of fresh water. It's absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of connecting the dots on some different things that you've said, but it sounds like really the variability in water events, either, droughts or now maybe super droughts, if we're categorizing, I've read some recent stuff of, it's, 30 years, maybe this is just the new status quo. But then kind of in that frequency, it seems like there are some feedback loops, for instance, like the Ogallala Aquifer, if you don't have if you have dry soil, it's going to saturate quickly. If you have a large rainwater event, my understanding is that will not actually replenish nearly as much as you'll have surface water flows and potentially contamination. So I guess some of this, and mostly I'm looking for, am I on the right track? But it seems like part of the challenge with dealing with climate change with this is the actual variability across kind of space and time for where and how much water will be present in any area, since it's changing rapidly. Is that kind of a correct understanding, do you think?
I think that's all well said. It's all valid. And there's an awful lot of uncertainty, which is why we work so thoughtfully with companies on everything from assessing their risk in the first place to watershed planning and even collaborative projects where you have multiple companies working in the same geography, because issues are at such a scale that no single company can actually address them all by themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Julie, is this something where a company will come to you and they will consult whether they should either, maybe build a site here in a city as opposed to like moving out to the Midwest, or is that something, questions you guys hear all the time?
So, Brandon, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that thought process of thinking about water before sites are built is not something that's mainstream, and it's something that we're trying to change. That paradigm shift of considering the environmental factors, not only around like energy, for example, like data center companies, when they are siting new locations. One of my clients recently shared that before we did a water risk study for them, the only water consideration that they actually were looking into was whether or not the location was in a floodplain. And, water availability for a data center is critical, especially if they're using that water supply to cool their equipment.
Yep.
And cooling data centers is important, very critical. So I would like to see more of this, and we always try to have that conversation with our clients, especially around our due diligence practice area when we're looking at helping clients around that acquisition, the mergers and acquisition piece.
Water security and how you're making sure that you've got the right planning, mitigation, redundancy, kind of thought process kicked off well in advance of, especially breaking ground. But, it sounds like M&A, there could be a lot of consideration. So, I'd love to know a little bit about, from your, kind of perspective, what are you seeing companies doing to kind of manage this problem and, to really try to achieve more water security, into the future?
Definitely. So water-related business risks are extremely local. So you can't apply one strategy in one watershed and think it will work in the other watershed. You have to really understand the different issues at the watershed level and how that company is impacting and depending on that watershed. So firstly, we like to work with companies to understand what the different risks are, their physical risks related to that quality, the availability of their supply, that infrastructure, then what's going on with the regulatory environment and the governance environment, and how is that water being managed. And then we look at that social reputational component of what are their brand image risks. So we help them come up with a portfolio-wide plan, and then based on where their operations are and what those different risks are, we help them come up with those action plans, those roadmaps. So one example might be a facility operating in a water stressed location might look at optimizing their facility or looking at how they might reuse their wastewater. So they might also look at their supply chain, maybe helping local farmers with sustainable irrigation, drip irrigation, soil moisture monitoring. Might partner with on that collaborative action level that Michael mentioned earlier. So how can they work together to make their efforts have a bigger impact within that watershed, looking at different replenishment opportunities. Maybe it's working with the city or their water municipal supplier on rainwater harvesting techniques, or putting in ground or wells into the ground so that when it rains, all of that water has a place to go and help get it back into the aquifer efficiently instead of just running off. So those are some of the things that we're seeing companies come together on and do to improve their water stewardship and the watershed security of where they're operating.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I'm asking from a place of complete ignorance. I'm just genuinely curious. Is there kind of any public-private partnership kind of talks going on that you've seen? I guess it seems like depending on the location of your facility, your municipal planning, your POTWs, maybe more permeable surfaces. Could we rework our, like you're in Tempe or Scottsdale? One of my co-founders went to Arizona State University, so Phoenix. Large impermeable, kind of surfaces everywhere. Is that something that I guess our government's really talking with food and beverage companies or vice versa to try to figure out how we can potentially leverage things that could kind of work together? Is this in its early days? Yeah, just curious for either one of you.
My instinct is that that's relatively rare. It does happen in the form of regulation. For example, I know states like Minnesota have restrictions with respect to how much surface water can be discharged from an industrial site, and there are certain controls that are expected regarding contamination. So think of a parking lot, for example, where you might have petroleum products dripping off of vehicles. There's actually rules about the acceptable levels for that runoff leaving the site. That's not everywhere. States vary, right? So it's a huge space, though, and I think just as we're trying to foster industry-wide collaborations on these topics, kind of the next frontier for that would be public-private partnerships. And we should mention, by the way, that Antea Group is the the host organization for something called the Beverage Industry Environmental Roundtable, or
Mm.
conveniently beer, which is made up of the world's largest beverage companies. And it's a collaborative space to deal with some of these issues that are pre-competitive in nature, whether that's
Mm.
benchmarking, improvements with respect to efficiency in the production cycle, or even fostering some of these watershed level collaborations that we talked about, where 3 or 4 or 6 companies come together in a watershed and even look at things like how to reduce plastic waste entering the waterway, in addition to things like ensuring upstream stewardship and going as far maybe as tree planting or stream bank restoration. So beer is an important part of our portfolio because it brings those companies together and creates this culture of understanding around the importance of these issues, not just from a singular business interest or operational risk perspective, but really what civil society kind of expects of mature corporations, right, in 2020.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
that is right before we jumped on. I was reading an article about it was a beer company actually, and they were getting pushback from the farmers, the citizens, like almost trying to make sure they don't come in that city, which is unheard of because people want jobs. But now people are now looking at the water supply. Is this something that is going to become more and more prevalent in your mind,
Oh, there's no question about it. If people are aware of almost any company. I mean, Julie mentioned the data centers. Uh, People don't necessarily connect that they're a huge user of water, but anytime a new company is, visibly siting in a community, whether that's to build a new factory or, in the case of the beverage industry, trying to identify new sources of water that they can use, people become aware of that and they rightfully have concerns. And so, and by the way, that concern has gone now just from sort of the citizen activism piece that we're talking about to how the investor community looks at companies.
Hmm.
You've heard the phrase ESG, environmental, social, and governance. This is the lens through which big investors are increasingly directing capital investment. If you're not leading on these issues, there are more and more investors every day who are going to put pressure on companies and expect improvement. And for those companies that don't keep pace, their access to capital is going to become increasingly challenging. The leaders will get favorable interest rates. And in some instances, if you look now at how investors are no longer committing to support oil and gas, the continuum of that is going to move into other sectors where if companies aren't ahead of this curve on environmental responsibility, they're similarly going to find themselves unable to attract investment. So that whole context of, again, civil society's expectations, it used to be sort of when I started in this field, it was kind of a quaint uh, way to enhance your brand and maybe attract some more socially or environmentally oriented consumers. It's gone way beyond that now. This is the
Hmm.
new mainstream.
Yeah, that actually ties into a topic that we've actually talked about even on another campfire session with trends in digital transformation in this space. And I think really the rise of the internet. So you've got consumers who can access all sorts of information in ways they couldn't before. And then you also have on the governmental end and in industry just more sophisticated ways to collect more data and process it quicker, and it's not on paper. And I think yeah, we've just seen a lot of, kind of increased stakeholder awareness of, kind of what is operationally happening. And that, yeah, that's a trend that we're just seeing as well. And I think is, tied into technology and kind of consumer preferences in some unique ways that are, both in kind of food and beverage, but then, as you said, oil and gas. And I think, just across many industries, it's now, more challenging, I think, than it used to manage your stakeholders because your activist is your everyday Main Street person who just doesn't want to, have that in their city potentially, or is more aware of the issues.
Well, and just to comment on this sort of moment in time with COVID-19 and the pandemic.
Hmm.
I think for our business, we would have expected that there would be a slowdown, and in certain aspects of the business, that's true because some companies aren't operating at all, and others
Hmm.
are kind of in the middle. But the sustainability practice in our company is actually on kind of a growth trajectory, and I think the reason for that in these last few months has to do with the fact that in a recession, companies are increasingly looking for ways to save costs.
Hmm.
Um, so if you're using less water, you're using less energy, you're reducing your risk. That all meets that requirement of bringing costs down, both in the short term and the longer term. And it's also the case that remember that this pressure I talked about from the ESG investor community that has only amplified in this because now the investors are saying, holy smokes, it's always been true that companies that performed better on environmental metrics performed better writ large, just as businesses. And so now they understand that this instrument of really reviewing risk through the lens of ESG is a great way to filter out the companies that really don't have the operational rigor that investors want to see. So the combined forces of the pandemic and the investor pressure really are attracting more and more people to these issues, and it's been great for us from a business standpoint.
Hmm. That's fascinating.
That is fascinating. So we've been kind of digging in on the beverage, putting the beverage in, the water inside the beverage. How else are companies using water throughout their operations?
You want to take that, Julie?
Yeah, sure. Um, are you asking particularly about the beverage industry itself?
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Okay. So, besides growing their ingredients, that whole agricultural supply chain processes between those two beverage types, and then bottling facilities, they continue to demonstrate the least water and energy intensive processes because as some bottling facilities, such as the wine and distilled spirits bottlers, they receive their finished beverages from those products being produced at different locations. So, it's used in the ingredient manufacturing, it's used in the cleaning, and then of course there's when you're done with the water that doesn't go into your product, that goes out as wastewater. So there's a lot of opportunities. The wastewater reuse is a completely untapped resource, pretty much across the board.
Hmm.
Can I add a couple things to that list?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Please.
remember I was with the bottled water industry for a while. So, there's two kinds of bottled water. Typically, there's spring water, which to a certain extent might be filtered or may not, but is typically treated with ultraviolet light and so on. That filtration process can often result in some wastewater because you're using water to sort of flush out certain contaminants. If you're using a reverse osmosis filtration system, it uses quite a lot of water. However, it's still true that the beverage that uses the least amount of water in its production is bottled water. And that's because of what Julie said with respect to things like agricultural ingredients. If you're putting sugar or colorings or flavorings, or in the case of beer, you've got barley and hops. There's a lot of water being used in the supply chain. The other piece that I'll mention is, processed water washing a facility. If you're doing things like carbonated soft drinks where you have sugars present, every once in a while you have to shut down that line entirely and wash everything out for purposes of maintaining cleanliness and health. So there's a lot of different, again, invisible uses of water that sort of add up to an awful lot of water going out the pipe beyond what's going into the package.
Mm.
The industry standard I read was 1.5 gallons of water per gallon of beverage. Is that still the standard? And also, what are companies doing to kind of improve this as they move on?
Numbers are funny things, right?
Yeah.
So that average, I have to wonder if that's for bottled water or it might be soft drinks and bottled water. It's definitely not all beverages, and I'll give you a couple of examples. So carbonated soft drinks use about 2.5 times as much water to produce per unit as bottled water. So imagine if that average is right for bottled water. If a factory is running 1.5 for a distilled water product, the company across the road making cola is probably using 3 units of water per unit of product. That gets worse when you go over to the beer factory. It goes up to about 4.5. And then if you think about sort of the full life cycle of certain beverages, think about wine. Uh,
Hmm.
you've got all the agricultural production, the processed water, and the beverage itself. That's running about 30 units
Oof.
per unit of product. And the one that always fascinates me is coffee. Remember, most times people make coffee in a pot. That's changed with pods, right? You can make 1 cup and it uses less water overall, but there's an awful lot of coffee that gets brewed and then poured down the drain as it gets stale, especially under normal circumstances when restaurants are open. Um, Coffee tends to run as an industry average about 40 units of water. Pardon me, 40 units of water per unit of coffee. So
Hmm.
It's huge.
this stuff gets tricky, and if you really want your brain to hurt, this isn't a beverage, but ethanol is the worst villain because it takes about 30,000 gallons of water to produce a gallon of ethanol.
Hmm.
And as we look forward and think about, what's the right energy future, this is a place where energy and water reconnect because do we need ethanol as a supplemental fuel or do we actually need that fresh water for something that might be more important to human survival? So there's a lot of challenging, gnarly issues that come out of this when you really start digging into the numbers.
For sure. Would fracking? Do you have any idea what that ratio would be? I guess it would be like I guess per gallon of natural gas, like liquid natural gas.
You know what? I'm sorry, I don't know that number. I know it's a big number,
It's got to
Yeah,
be huge. Yeah.
huge.
right? And there you're dealing with really hazardous chemicals and a lot of energy associated with the treatment of those chemicals. So yeah,
Hmm.
water is again, it's just such an important issue, and it permeates really every industry, but certainly for food and beverage because
Hmm.
it's vital to human survival, right?
Hmm.
Absolutely. Those are some interesting numbers, especially the coffee really threw me back. I didn't really, I didn't think about it. It's something that really I don't think about and most citizens don't think about, Luke. We kind of chatted about this earlier. It was just an interesting topic that we were so ready to talk about because we were just ready to soak up all the knowledge about, water usage and scarcity.
Well, look,
Hmm.
don't feel guilty if you're rinsing out your coffee pot because life is too short to drink that stuff.
I
I was
drink
just,
all my coffee that I make,
yeah.
to be honest.
Luke drinks fresh coffee, old coffee, doesn't matter. It's coffee, he's drinking
I'll get the
it.
coffee done. Yep, that is true.
So as we kind of move away from kind of the facts and the numbers, this is kind of a moral obligation question. As the food and bev industry uses a lot of water, as we talked about, huge numbers, 80%. What do you think their duty is? What are they morally obligated to do, in your opinion?
Julie, why don't you take a shot at that?
Sure. So I personally think that we all have obligations, even as consumers. But on that company level, I think every company should be looking at water, especially if they are in specific geographies where water issues are very well known. So, regardless if they're a big water user or a small water user, the fact that they use water um, means we all have that shared responsibility of being responsible stewards of those resources. So, and besides that moral obligation, it's an operational obligation
Mhm.
to have that clean, safe, fresh water. And Michael, I'll pass it over to you because I know you have more to contribute there.
Well, in thinking about this question, my personal view supports everything that Julie said. I think it's the right way to do business, but more pragmatically, just if as a business leader, um, going back to this ESG dynamic and what investors expect. If you're a publicly traded company, you have an obligation to serve your shareholders, right? And if you're neglecting these issues and creating risk, or you're neglecting these issues and creating financial headwinds for your company, you're not fulfilling your fiduciary obligations, right?
Hmm.
So it's useful, and I think it's important to have a discussion about moral obligations and ethical expectations that civil society might have of corporate actors. But the baseline pragmatic calculus is, are you doing your job? And to
Hmm.
do your job responsibly as a business leader, you have got to handle these issues proactively. Because if you get a surprise, if the city that your plant is operating in hits day zero and you have to shut down, you failed. So that's pretty real.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely.
The good
Okay.
news is we don't have any really strong feelings about these.
So this is a multi-layered issue that is not going to be solved overnight. So, what are the long-term effects that can impact the bottom line for a business?
I'll start, and Michael, I'll ask you to add. So, some stories that I've heard over the years working with clients, for example, going back to the coffee issue, there was so one of the biggest coffee companies in the world. One of their former sustainability directors shared with me that in some South American country, I apologize, I don't remember which one, but they had been implementing sustainable agricultural practices, and they were doing test cases on how their coffee was growing, like shade grown versus just your traditional cut and monocropping their coffee plantation.
Yeah, I mean, those are great examples of sort of direct water use and water risks. I'll speak to kind of a new trend in agriculture, and it does go to this question of bottom line impacts over the long term. There's a new, it's not really new, but there's a movement now being adopted by very large companies around something called regenerative agriculture. And this is the notion of, instead of an industrial model where we supplement soil chemistry with fossil fuel based fertilizers and accelerate growth by wasteful irrigation, we actually take it in the other direction. So it's the idea of maintaining soil chemistry through careful management, the idea of planting alternate crops instead of monocultures, putting cover crops in during times of the year that the primary cash crop is not in production. These kinds of practices do things like increase the amount of water that can be stored in the soil, which reduces the amount of irrigation that's ultimately necessary. Conveniently, regenerative practices also maintain higher levels of soil carbon. People don't often think about it, but soil is the single biggest store, if you will, for carbon. So if we're storing more carbon in the soil, that means there's less in the atmosphere. And when you're doing these kinds of regenerative practices, typically at the time of harvest, where most water and carbon are released out of the soil, the regenerative crops tend to release less. So over the long term, and we're waiting to see because this is such a new trend, the big question is, can you do regenerative agriculture at scale
Hmm.
and come out ahead uh, from a financial perspective? And my suspicion is that you can, because for one thing, you're reducing the costs of inputting all of those artificial fertilizers. If you're paying for your water, which in many instances companies need to, um, you're paying less in that cost, whether it's the direct cost of the water or the cost to transport the water and the energy costs. So it's an interesting space to watch. And by the way, by having those cover crops in place, by not having monocultures, you're actually also making a contribution to biodiversity,
Hmm.
increased pollinator populations, and so on. So I think if we're really going to live on this planet over the long term, regenerative agriculture is probably one of the single hottest topics in my mind that's going to make what we're doing here sustainable.
So just to kind of wrap that question all up, so you're saying that not only if you're not making the appropriate steps, you could be harming the environment, but you could be actually kind of hurting your business. And like you said, those day zero examples are great examples. If you're not doing the right thing, good for business is also good for the environment.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So, Julie and Michael, this has been really great to have you both on. So to kind of wrap it up for our listeners, viewers, love to just kind of end with a final question of, for each of you, what are some questions that with your expertise, you would recommend large food and beverage companies to go through and ask themselves as they're starting to, unpack and think through some of these topics that we've been talking about today? Let's start with Julie and then Michael, bring us home.
Great.
Awesome. I would say that a company should ask themselves, and going back to what I said in the beginning, if my business's water was shut off, how long could my doors stay open? And most likely they might say maybe 6 hours if they had some kind of on-site storage. And so, really thinking about that business continuity piece. So if businesses really can understand their risk exposure that especially their source water is facing and their supply chain is facing, then they can certainly make that business case to their corporate leaders to mandate that responsible use and consumption of the precious resource that is largely unappreciated.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So ask yourself, how long could I operate with no water?
Right.
That's great. Awesome. Michael, what's the question you think they should ask?
I'll put it in two buckets. So the first is sort of, how aware are you of your conditions today? So Julie talked about your risk, right? So do you have all the available data on quantity and quality for your water sources? Do you understand the full range of alternatives if one of those sources should become unavailable? Are you tracking trends in terms of other users and how much water is being consumed in that watershed? If you're not understanding where you are, you're not going to recognize changes when they come, and you're not going to be prepared to adapt. So that's bucket number one. The second bucket would be, what's your plan, right? So Julie rightfully described scenarios where there's too much water. Do you have a climate adaptation plan? Do you have a business continuity plan? When I was with Nestle Waters, we got caught by surprise in the great state of Maine when one of our factories there got surrounded by floodwaters in a hurricane, and we couldn't get trucks out of the plant to service our primary market, which was New York City. So, those are the kinds of things that you don't want to find out about or think about for the first time when they happen. You want to have a strategy for how you're going to deal with it when it comes. And for most operations anywhere in the world, it's not an if, it's a when.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. So, assess where you're at and then ask yourself, what's your plan? That's really great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Brandon?
Michael, Julie, again, thank you guys for joining us. If for our viewers and listeners, if you have any questions for us, just leave a comment below. You can also contact each of us directly on LinkedIn. If you have any questions about Encamp, you can go to www.encamp.com. Michael, can you go ahead and plug your website as well?
Sure. So you can find us at anteagroup.com. And if you're looking for information specifically on food and beverage, there's a food and beverage segment page that has my contact information. You'll see Julie there under the water stewardship services, and we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to our listeners. All right, guys. See you soon.
Thanks, guys.